Climate change has been one of the most contentious environmental concerns for both scientists and policymakers. The scientific evidence for increases in greenhouse gases, or GHGs, which trap heat, and the physical impact of these processes has been well known to science for decades and is not contested. However, the interaction of these processes with other natural cycles and the observable changes in temperature being short-term versus long-term remain contested. The debate on the magnitude and causality of climate change has been increasingly polarized by various interest groups that continue to challenge each other's credibility. Even the popular media has picked up on the polarization of the debate, exemplified by movies such as The Day After Tomorrow and the documentary produced by former Vice President Al Gore titled An Inconvenient Truth. Skeptics of climate change have been equally strident in their publications, ranging from titles such as The State of Fear by the late best-selling author Michael Crichton to the recent Cato Institute book titled Meltdown: The Predictable Distortion of Global Warming. So let us consider the questions on which the conflict is predicated. Until recently, there has been little attempt by social scientists to explore the issues of climate change from a conflict resolution perspective. In 2006, Dessler and Parson provide the first systematic examination of the climate change debate and suggest that four key questions first need to be recognized. Is the climate changing? Are human activities responsible for the observed changes? What are the likely climate changes in the future? What will be the impacts of these future climatic changes? I would add to this series a fifth question. Can human intervention to reduce these changes have any impact? This fifth question is particularly important to consider in order to formulate effective policy recommendations at an international level because of extreme income inequality that the world faces. Limited resources being expended on prevention rather than adaptation by development donors thus become highly consequential. The fifth question also ties in with Dessler and Parsons' suggestion that we extricate positive from normative statements about global warming. The former being expository material about the state of the world's climate, and the latter implying how we would like the world to behave. As shown in this flow diagram that I have prepared to explain the argument sequence, the problem of global warming starts with an empirical observation about an increase in various greenhouse gases from human sources. There is no debate about this issue, as well as the next step, that is, the rise of greenhouse gases in the atmosphere, which are accepted by all sides in the controversy. It is important to note that the question of endogeneity or causal directionality, as represented by the arrows in the diagram, is also posed at multiple levels. For example, some questions have been raised by scientists about whether the rise in carbon dioxide is caused by a change in climate itself, reversing part of the assumed causality. Starting off with what is known for certain, we can move along and see how differences in opinion arise based on differing assumptions. The two decision diamonds in the diagram critically suggest how we can get stuck in a loop of uncertainty and decision paralysis in the global warming debate. The first point of indecision occurs with observational uncertainty because of the enormous complexity of variables in climate science. The second point of indecision that can lead to a spiraling of inaction occurs when we consider prescriptive means to reduce the impact of climate change. At this point, the inevitability of change shifts the argument to adaptation without considering other factors. The main challenge arises regarding the interface of natural versus anthropogenic impacts on the climate. Scientific methods and peer review processes are considered the touchstone for ensuring objectivity. However, proponents of climate change are also limited with an important additional imperative of time constraints to ensure effective remedial action. Therefore, the peer review process must proceed with an important normative concern in mind. If climate change is occurring, action must be imminent, or else the research will be in vain. This inherent normative element in climate change research does indeed give proponents of climate change a more activist edge than other scientists. Critics of climate change, such as MIT professor Richard Lindzen, have also argued that the peer review process has itself been corrupted by the preponderance of views about climate change. Given the complexity of the conflict of causality involved in climate change and the difficulty in empirical observation and description, it is highly unlikely that the conflict can be resolved on purely scientific terms. If we continue to articulate our call for action on purely scientific terms about diagnosing the problem, we are likely to remain entrapped in the cycle of further research or incremental policies that might not get us the results we seek. Even if we can claim to have scientific consensus through bodies such as the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, the dissenting voices will remain in the background and polarization is likely to continue. If the main goal is reduction of global warming effects, we should invest our scientific resources to provide solutions to these challenges in ways that are most socially acceptable. However, if the goal is to go beyond just global warming and change consumer behavior on ethical and moral grounds, then simply focusing on global warming as a driver is likely to muddle the planning process for preventative action. Focusing on other derivative impacts of some drivers of global warming might also resolve the conflict because there is less teleological uncertainty about some other resource constraints. The most significant focal point of such action is the peak oil movement that seeks to look for alternative sources of energy on the very simple and irrefutable premise that fossil fuels are indeed non-renewable. There is, however, a complication to this approach, since one can also argue that despite being non-renewable, it makes sense to at least harness all the energy we can from existing supplies of fossil fuels. At this point, the security argument for measured conservation of these limited supplies is likely to be more productive. Investing in alternative sources of energy is likely to be useful in the long run because diversification makes sense from a risk management perspective. Conflict over the science and policy of climate change will require us to be innovative in looking for justification for proposed solutions that tap into many of these disparate constituencies. Instead of having a debate on climate change, a reframing of the issue as fossil fuel depletion and coping strategies at a global level is likely to be more consequential. Linking climate policy to other established environmental agreements as a means of regime interplay is also possible, such as with biodiversity conservation. We also must be careful to not let expeditious action on climate change lead to spillover problems from alternatives such as nuclear power. All pathways need to be considered simultaneously, but without conflating issues as suggested in the preceding flow diagram. By following a structured process of issue delineation and reframing of the conflict, we may finally reach resolution to this confounding challenge of our times. Climate change has defied effective international environmental governance because of these aforementioned challenges. But in 2015, we did see a glimmer of hope with the Paris Agreement that ended almost a decade of deadlock on actionable policy. The following are the key elements of the 2015 Paris Agreement. There is a long-term goal of keeping the increase in global average temperature to well below 2 degrees centigrade above pre-industrial levels. Another aim is to limit the increase to 1.5 degrees centigrade, since this would significantly reduce risks and the impacts of climate change. An agreed need for global emissions to peak as soon as possible, recognizing that this will take longer for developing countries, is also noted. and then a goal to undertake rapid reductions thereafter in accordance with the best available science is stipulated. Now, to consider accountability in financing, the Paris Agreement requires a global stocktake, an overall assessment of how countries are doing in cutting their emissions compared to their national levels starting in 2023 and 5 years thereafter. The agreement, which takes effect in 2020, calls on nations to establish a new collective quantified goal of at least $100 billion a year in climate-related financing by 2020. This fund was actually created in an earlier agreement in Copenhagen, but it was not resourced to the level required to meet the Paris targets. Once we have this fund established and launched fully, this could be a major resource for developing countries in moving and transitioning towards more effective green technologies. The actual impact of the Paris Agreement remains to be seen, but perhaps we can conclude with an aspirational quotation from none other than Barack Obama when he was speaking to a group of young researchers at Georgetown University and laid out the plan of action for an agreement on climate change. And I quote, "What we need is an agreement that's ambitious, because that's what the scale of the challenge demands. We need an inclusive agreement because every country has to play its part. And we need an agreement that's flexible because different nations have different needs. And if we can come together and get this right, we can define a sustainable future for your generation."